Welcome to the workshop on parameterized plots and reports with R and Quarto. So a very brief introduction to who I am. So I am a lecturer in health data science based in the medical school at Lancaster University in the northwest of England. My background is in statistics, and I've sort of been working in data science consultancy and training sort of in between leaving and coming back to academia. I've been using R for sort of over 10 years now, and I've authored quite a few R packages for visualization. So in terms of what to expect during this workshop, we're going to do a combination of some slides, as you can see, some live coding examples, and there's going to be some exercises for you to participate in. Please feel free to ask questions throughout. Just pop your questions in the chat. If they are urgent questions, I'll try to answer them straight away, but otherwise I'll probably group them together and answer them while you're working on the exercises. So there are some resources for this workshop. As Phil said, there are resources on Posit Clouds, which I'll share the link to in a second, but I've just shared the link to the course website in the chat. Okay, so it's got a link to these slides if you want them for yourself. It's got the examples that I'm going to be doing. Fair warning, they might not be identical, as happens when you do live demonstrations. And there's some exercise questions, and there's some links to other useful resources as well. So the first thing we're going to start with is looking at parameterized plots with ggplot2. So first of all, just to clarify what I actually mean by parameterized plots, I'm essentially thinking about plots where one or more aspects of the visualization are controlled by one or more parameters. So that might be things like the time period that your visualization is showing, so like start and end dates. It might be for geographic regions. So if you want to make the same sort of map for different areas of the world, for example, or it might be that you're changing some assumptions about your data if you're visualizing the outputs of different models. So these parameters can control the underlying data, but they can also control things like the caption, the titles, or the color in your plots. So you can see on the right-hand side of the screen here, I created some parameterized plots quite recently, looking at sort of monarchs over different time periods. So this is just one function, and you put in the name of the time period, and you can make 12 different plots, kind of in one line of code. And you might also be wondering why on earth would you want to do that? Sort of parameterizing things and building functions sort of sounds like more work. It's essentially so that you end up not repeating yourself. So once you have parameterized the plot, it's much quicker to make different versions of the same one. So if you make the same plot every month, if you do like a monthly report, you don't want to be sort of manually editing that code every month. You can just run your parameterized function. It also means your R scripts are shorter and easier to read because you're not copying and pasting code multiple times. And it's much easier to have a sort of consistent layout between plots. If you are making the same plot multiple times and you're using the same function, it should always look the same. So when we talk about parameterizing plots, we will get to the sort of let's make functions, but I typically start with just making some variables. So I don't necessarily have to jump straight into a function. Quite often at the start of a script, I'll have a sort of here's a list of the variables. So that might be something like the time period, like the month or year that you're going to plot, but it might also be things like colors. Okay. So it could be also fonts or potentially output types. Okay. So it's thinking about if you're going to make different versions of this plot, what is it that's going to change? Okay. And then we take those variables and put them into a function. But because we started thinking about those variables early on, it makes the sort of function building much easier. Okay. And if you sort of use the same data for every version of your plot, you can add some default arguments in to make your own code even sort of smoother and quicker. Okay, so we're gonna jump over to Posit Cloud. I'm going to do a little bit of a demonstration around taking some plotting code and turning it into something that has parameters, and then turning it into something that has that is essentially a function. Okay. So I think I can share the link to Posit Cloud in the chat. And if you do have any problems with this, do just drop a message in the chat to Phil, and he should be able to help you out with that. So what you should see in the Posit Cloud space is there are some different examples scripts. So we're going to start off, if you open up for the example here, looking at the Gapminder data. Okay, so we start off, I'm just going to load the Gapminder package and show you a little bit of what that data looks like. Okay. Okay, so we have different columns, so different countries, the continent the country's on, the year that the data is about, and then 3 different variables. So life expectancy, population, and GDP. So we have a sort of script here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to run the script. Okay. Okay. So just kind of a little bit of a recap. Today we're going to be working with the Gapminder dataset. So you should be able to do library Gapminder and then view the Gapminder data. Okay. So we have data on different countries, different continents, and different years, and the variables we have are life expectancy, population, and GDP. So when you're starting to look at this data, what you'll see is that there are those sort of first 3 columns are columns that you might want to use to parameterize a report. Okay, so you might want to create, say, a scatter plot for every single country, or you might want to make bar charts for each continent, or do some sort of chart for each year of the data. So there's different sort of ways we could subset this data. And we're going to look at a couple of different examples. Okay, so if you open up the gapminder underscore continent .r file, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to sort of run this, and I'll show you the plot that it makes. Okay, so what we want to do here is we're going to, first of all, subset the data. Okay, so we're going to look just at Asia. So we use filter from dplyr to subset based on the continent. And then we're making a box plot showing the range of life expectancy over time. Right? So I've sort of given you this code. You don't need to kind of write it yourself. But what we're going to do is we're going to think about how would we transform this code, which is sort of has hard-coded values to subset the data and do things like write sort of captions, for example, and turn that into something that's parameterized. Okay, so the thing that we're actually sort of parameterizing is the continent. That's the main parameter we have. So I'm going to start off up here, creating a variable called choose continent. Okay, and I'm going to give that the value Asia. Okay, so I'm basically going to recreate this plot, but I'm going to use parameters instead. Okay. I hope that the size of the code on screen is big enough for y'all to see. Do let me know if you want font sizes larger. Okay. So then what I'm going to do is I'm going to start editing this code. So rather than hard coding the continent that I want to use to filter the data, I'm going to put in that variable. Okay. My data is not actually going to change, okay, because it's subsetting it the same way, but it's based on this variable instead. Okay. What I am going to do though is I'm going to sort of rename it something slightly better. Okay, so rather than giving it my subsetted data a name based on the continent I've subsetted it with, I'm going to give it a slightly more generic name of Gapminder continent. Okay. And then I'm going to replace the input data for my ggplot with that sort of slightly nicer named data. The box plotting code doesn't need to change, okay, regardless of how I subset the data, those variable names are still the same. So we can leave that alone. Similarly with the X and Y axes, okay, as long as we're always putting life expectancy on the Y-axis, we don't need to change those labels. But what we do need to change is the title. Okay, so the title has our continent in the title. So we want to make sure that we replace this hard-coded title with our variable. Okay, so there are a couple of different ways to do this in R. I quite often use the glue package. Okay, so glue is basically a way of gluing in values from variables in R into sentences. Okay? So instead of just putting in a sort of string in quotation marks, we put the string in quotation marks inside the glue function. And we take out our hard-coded continent name. And then in curly brackets, we put in the variable that should go in there. Okay? And that will basically take the value that choose continent has and glue it into that sentence. So if I rerun this, okay, you can see I get exactly the same plot. Nothing changes. Okay? One thing that is I find really useful is to actually change it from one continent to another. Okay, so for example, if I create the plot for Europe, change the value of my parameter, okay, my plot updates, and you can see that my title updates as well. Okay, and so sort of rather than just trying to recreate the plot for one continent, if you change the value of the parameter, you make sure that there's sort of nothing left related to the old parameter value. And then what we can do is basically take this and put it into a function. Okay, so this sort of list of parameters you have, they're going to become the arguments to your function. And then the code for filtering and plotting the data is going to become the body of the function. Okay. So if you create a function called continent box plot, okay, so that is a function, okay, and we can just take this code here, copy and paste it into the body of the function, and cut and paste our argument in here. Okay, you can choose to use a default value if you want to. For this example, I would probably not leave a sort of a default value for choose continent. But what I am going to do is put in another argument for the data and give that the default gapminder data set. Okay, and in a more sort of realistic example, that can be useful if your data is updating or you're downloading a new file each month. You can sort of pass in the file as an argument if you need to. Okay, so we can run sort of load our function into R and then just test that our function works. Okay, so just pass in the name of the continent and that updates. So we can just pass in any value here. Okay. So it's your turn to make some parameterized plots. So what I want you to do is basically create a variable to choose a year in the Gapminder data. And then if you open up in Posit Cloud, there's a file called Gapminder year. Okay? And what you're going to do is basically take the code that's in that file and turn it into a function that has the data and the year as arguments. Check it works. Okay. If you get through that and you're finding that kind of easy, think about adding another argument to your function that lets a user define the color of the bars. And then think a little bit about how you might want to improve your function even more. Okay, so I will let you get started on that. If you do have any questions, just pop them in the chat and I will do my best to answer those.
So it sounds like we have some new R programmers on, and they were wondering like the best way to run the code and work with the code. Typically, I just highlight it and run it, but I didn't know if you kind of like the control enter or another trick that you prefer.
I tend to use Control and Enter. So you can just highlight a line of code and then click the Run button. If I'm like running sort of one line of code or a sort of multiple lines of code, I tend to just sort of have my cursor at the end of that block of code and then hit Control and Enter. And that will run basically everything from the start of that. And yeah, as Libby says in the chat, Command and Enter if you're a Mac user. Yeah, so I do tend to use Control and Enter instead of manually hitting the run button. Yeah, I can see there's one question in the chat of basically what's the benefit of using glue instead of paste. So what you will see during this workshop is I do tend to actually switch between both of them. So paste is from base R. So if you are just making base R plots and you don't want to load extra dependencies, then paste is super useful. What I quite like about glue, if I go back to this example, is that you're sort of putting the variables in the sentence, so you can sort of, it feels a little bit more readable. So in my head, this sort of reads a little bit more like a normal sentence, especially if you choose well-named variable names. Whereas paste, the sentences and the variables end up a little bit more broken up and it feels a little bit less readable. Right. Um,
I'd probably say for people on the call that's coming from SAS to R, the parameterized nature is almost like SAS macro variables, where they pass in variables into their macros. And SAS macros tend to be more like functions in R or packages, for example. Actually, packages tend to be a little bit more like procs. And so in R, you have lots of packages that we'll use today, and those tend to be more like the procs that you see in SAS. So hopefully that helps if you're trying to make a connection to the two.
Okay, I'll try to answer another couple of questions that are coming in the chat. So one of the questions is, are there limitations to what you can parameterize? Can you do it with directories? Um, in my in my head, there are essentially no limits to what you can parameterize. Anything that you could put as an argument to a function could be a parameter. So if you, for example, if you have data in sort of multiple directories, you could pass in the directory as the argument, sort of instead of doing data equals gapminder, you could have data equals, look in this directory, and then edit your function to read in the data from that directory. So as long as you can find a way to extract the elements from your processing code or your plotting code to become a function argument, then I think you can parameterize it. It gets a little bit kind of more difficult sometimes. The examples we're working with here are relatively nice, because the variables in the gapminder data are sort of nicely formatted. So we just have one sort of one parameter that we can use to filter, and in the text in the sort of title. When you have sort of much messier, more horrible looking data, that gets a little bit harder, but you can usually come up with some way to still use those parameters. Another couple of questions. So one question is, will we talk about sending bundles of parameters to the documents so you don't have to change them manually? Yes. What I'm going to show you at the end of the workshop is basically how to render multiple different copies of your document with sort of one line of code, theoretically. Uh, one more question for now is one question is, why have I included the data equals gapminder? It's it's essentially because I don't want to rely on anything that exists in my global environment inside this function. Okay, so if I just put gapminder in here, it would be relying on the gapminder data already being loaded outside of the function. Here I'm sort of passing it in as an argument to the function. That's the main reason. It also means that you can change the data. So if you have the example of you get new data every month, then you can pass in, a file path to a CSV file or some other data, and you don't have to edit the function code. Um, so there's another few sort of questions in the chat. So one is about, do you define the type for the parameters? For example, the year is an integer. Um, and this sort of relates to something Libby has said in the chat, that not all years work in your function because not every single year exists in the data. And that is actually kind of what I was starting to get at with question number 5, the sort of bonus question about how could you improve your function. And one of the ways you could improve your function is by adding some checks on the input. Okay, so if you were to put in, for example, like 1953 for the year, that one doesn't exist in the data. So what you could do is put some checks on what are valid values. Okay, so if someone put in like a word instead of the year, you might want to sort of throw an error and ask a user to double check um, what that input is and whether it's correct. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm going to move on to the next section. If um if you're looking for the examples, you can go, if you go onto the course website and go onto examples, okay, you will see this is the sort of example that I went through. You will need the solutions for the exercises for sort of the next exercise. So if you haven't managed to kind of get through it or you got a little bit stuck, you can go onto the exercises page and there are some drop downs with the solutions there that you can borrow if you need them for the next exercise. Okay. So what we're going to look at now is parameterized reports. Okay, so we've looked at parameterizing plots, and we're now going to look at how do you make essentially documents. Now, obviously, what you'll see going through these examples is you don't necessarily need to parameterize your plots. You don't need to make those plotting functions. You could just sort of do all of it inside the Quarto document, inside the report. But parameterizing the plot functions first is, I think, good for 2 reasons. One is that it means you have to worry about changing less things inside your Quarto report. Okay, you only need to change the input values to your function, so you change one thing. It also makes it easier if you actually just want images sometimes, and sometimes you might just want a PNG file with a plot instead of a whole document. So it means that you have sort of 2 different potential outputs. Okay. So if you haven't used Quarto before, or you haven't heard of Quarto, it's basically a publishing system that lets you combine text with code. Okay, so you can have sort of text or images, plots, tables, and it makes these fully reproducible documents. Okay. We are going to be working mainly, well, completely with R today, but Quarto does work with Python, Julia, and Observable as well. So if you want to create parameterized reports, but you might be writing code in Python, you can basically do the same thing as we're doing for the rest of the session in Python as well. And it will give you a range of different output formats. So you can create PDFs, you can create HTML documents, Word documents, websites, presentations, pretty much anything you like. Okay. We are going to be mostly making HTML documents today, mainly because they tend to be the quickest. And when I'm sort of re-rendering and showing you how it updates, that is going to be the sort of easiest way to do that. Okay. So in terms of what is a Quarto document, what are the different bits of it? Okay. So the bit at the top of Quarto documents is called the YAML header. So there are it sort of starts and ends always with 3 dashes, and then inside the 3 dashes is everything that is sort of document-wide properties. Okay, so things like the title, the format. You can set global options for whether you want to execute your code or show your code, for example, in this YAML header. Okay? And then everything after that second set of three dashes is the content. Okay, so text, links, images, code, LaTeX equations, if you like, and things like references. Okay. As I mentioned, there are lots of different output types. We'll mainly be looking at HTML documents today, but it is quite easy to switch between different formats, and we'll look at some options for that. So we're going to start by looking at Quarto parameters. Okay? So the way that you add parameters to a Quarto document is sort of adding params and the colon to your YAML, and then having this list of parameters. So you can have multiple parameters in the one document. Okay, so here I've just got 1 year. Okay, but you could have as many parameters as you like, and they're just sort of indented underneath that params value. Okay. I can see a couple of people in the chat have asked a little bit about R Markdown. You can do something quite similar with R Markdown to parameterized documents. So if you are, if you haven't switched to Quarto, you can do something similar. And then once you actually have defined those parameters, you can use them in code, okay, by doing params $year. Okay, so this params here is sort of saying, look in this list of parameters, and then $year to access the individual parameter that you want. Okay, so it's reasonably easy to pull those parameters out into the code that's in your Quarto document. Okay, I know it's in our workshop, but I did mention you can do it with Python. It is a little bit different in Python. Okay, so in Python you create a separate code block, which is specifically for parameters, and you just define which parameters you want, and then they're just sort of available in any further Python code blocks. Okay, so it's specifically when we're using R that we're using these params in the YAML header. Okay, so let's jump back over to Posit Cloud. Okay, there are 2 Quarto documents in here for you. So I'm going to be using the example .qmd file for the examples I'm going through. And when it comes to the reports exercises, you're going to use the report .qmd one. Okay, so here I have my document YAML. Okay, so I have a title for my document, which is Gapminder report on life expectancy in Asia. And I've put this execute echo false. And that basically means that in the output document, hide all of the code. Okay, so if you're making a report for someone else, you don't necessarily need to show them the R code that makes all the plots. Okay. So just to kind of walk you through what's in here, I have one code block here that loads the packages I'm going to need. Okay, so Gapminder, dplyr, ggplot2, and glue. And then we have a sentence that sort of has some links in it. Okay, so you can add links in Quarto using sort of square brackets for the text you want to appear, and then the URL in round brackets. And we also have another code block here, which makes a sort of very generic plot, okay, sort of placeholder plot. And it has a figure caption, which says life expectancy in Asia, and it has a figure label, which we're cross-referencing up here. Okay, so I'm just going to render this document so you can see what it looks like. Okay, you might have to install knitr. I forgot to install that one. Okay, so this is going to render an HTML file. Okay. Okay. No, this isn't working. So if you give me 1 second, we'll look at where that output's appearing. So this renders a report that should just have a sentence and a single plot in it. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to take, again, anything that's the value that relates to my parameter and replace it with a parameter value. So in the YAML, so I do params uh, and then a colon, and then I choose a name for the parameter I want to use. I'm going to use the same parameter uh, name that I did in the plotting code. You don't have to use the same parameter name, but I kind of find it a little bit easier to match them up if you're using the same values. Okay, so I might do create a parameter called choose continent and give it the default value of Asia. Okay. So that's how you add a parameter to the document. Okay. So what I want to do now is edit the plotting code. Okay. So rather than this sort of placeholder code, I'm going to go back to the continent box plot code I made earlier and just copy and paste this whole thing here. Okay. So I just take all of that. Now what I need to do is at the moment, this loads in my plotting function. And then rather than doing continent box plot and sort of hard coding uh, the variable Asia, I'm going to access this params function here, params value. So I would do params $, choose underscore continent. Okay. So this will create a um a box plot specifically for the continent that is listed here. Okay, so if you change this value when you call the function, this will update. Okay. So there's a couple of things I want to kind of point out here. First of all is you might want to keep this function code somewhere else. Okay, you might have a code block at the start of your document that loads all your functions, or you might choose to keep all your functions sort of in a separate file, or potentially in an R package if it's something that you're sharing with multiple people or different people in your organization might be using this function. We don't need to replace these choose continent values with params $ choose continent because it's a function argument. So we're passing that params in as a function argument. Okay, so we don't need to replace all of the options inside our function with params because it's a function argument. And this is kind of what my I guess my argument for making plotting code is you can change one thing rather than sort of 2 or 3 things within your code. Okay. So when you render this document, okay, it will update. Okay. Okay, so that you get this document here. Okay, so you have Gapminder report on life expectancy in Asia. Here's a sentence. Okay, I really like the cross-referencing in Quarto. Okay, and you have your figure caption. Okay, but our plot is updating. And if I just sort of show you a different option here. Okay, so if I change the value of my parameter to Europe and re-render, okay, it updates. That hasn't opened. Let's preview. So if you're using Posit Clouds, it might by default open in a new window. There's a little sort of cog next to the render button. If you click preview in viewer pane, it will open up here, sort of in your RStudio window. Okay. So you can see here that our plot has updated. Okay, we have life expectancy in Europe because our data set and our plot has updated, but there are still some elements of our Quarto document that haven't changed yet. Okay, so it still has some text in the title we need to fix, some text in the sentence, and our figure caption. Okay, we are going to fix those in the next section, and then I'm also going to show you how to not have to manually type in different parameter values. Okay. So what I want you to do is go into Files, open up report.qmd. Okay. Take your plotting function that you made in the previous exercise, okay, or borrow the one from the course website if you didn't manage to finish yours. Pass the parameter into your plotting function. Okay, so adding that parameter, taking the parameter for the year, then change the value of the parameter and re-render it to check that your report updates in the way you think it should. Okay, so I'll leave this example up on screen, but you are working from the report.qmd file and adding a parameter for the year and then editing that plotting code. So I'm gonna there are another couple of questions in the chat. It's about if you put all of your functions in a separate R file, how do you get them into Quarto? So one option is to source that file, but there's kind of there's a nicer way in Quarto. So if you insert a code block, okay, in your code block, there you can add an option, file, and then you can pass in an R file. So let's say you keep all of your functions in a file called functions.r, okay? You might keep it in a folder, okay? So let's say you have your Quarto file, and then in the directory where your Quarto file is, you have a folder called R, and inside there is your functions.r file, and that's got all of your functions in it. You can sort of load that in, okay? And as long as you have either eval true in the main YAML or in here, that will basically just load that in for you. Okay, so that's kind of an alternative to using source, is you can sort of load files in. This is also quite nice if your functions are really big and you don't want your Quarto document to get super long and messy. You can keep it all in one R file and load it in the sort of code block at the top. Or some more questions in the chat, or so I guess some longer discussions about how Quarto is different to our Markdown, which is an absolutely huge question to try and answer. Yeah, as other people have kind of said, the kind of next generation of our Markdown, and it does work for multiple different languages. I also find it a little bit more user friendly. So some of the sort of hacky solutions to things that you have to do in our Markdown just kind of work um, with uh, with Quarto. Yes. So another question from Mike: am I going to show you how to change the figure caption? Yes, I am. So there are quite a few parts of this report that are not parameterized yet, not using our parameter values. So in the next section, I'm going to show you how do you change the title, text, and figure captions. So one of the questions is when I pass in a file here, could this be a sort of full file path? It can be a relative file path. Okay, so in the example here, I have the functions script is inside a folder called R. It can't be a sort of like a full directory path to a specific place on your laptop. it's sort of relative to where the Quarto file is. Okay, so if my report.qmd file was in the sort of in a folder, the R folder would be in the same directory as that, and then the function script would be inside that. So you can nest things, but it's always relative to your Quarto file, which is good practice anyway. So we are going to get started again. I can see there's another couple of questions which I can answer quickly. So there's one question about can you include callouts in a PDF? So callouts are kind of like little colored boxes that you can add to Quarto documents to sort of highlight a particular message or like a warning. You can include them in PDFs. They tend to just be formatted a little bit differently. So they are sort of designed for HTML or HTML variations of documents, but you don't get an error, basically. It does render, but it tends not to look as pretty. There's a one more sort of comment in the chat I want to just pick up on before we get started again, which was a comment about using an argument called data, because data is it's the name of an R function. So an object called data exists in your global environment. So is it a little bit risky to have data, inside a function? Um, I think like most of the tidyverse functions use data as the arguments there, so I assume it's quite safe. You can also are when you build functions, it looks in a specific environment first. Okay, so anytime you're using data inside your function, it's always looking sort of in that function environment first. So it will always find this data first. Before it looks in the global environment. So it's reasonably safe to use data as an argument, like as long as Libby says, unless you want to use the data function inside your function, then that's when it gets risky. But if you know you don't, then it should be absolutely fine. All right, let's get started on the next section. So what we're going to look at now is basically parameterized text with Quarto. Okay, so as I've kind of pointed out, there are elements of our report. Okay, so remember that we've updated our report to be a report about Europe rather than Asia, but we still have quite a lot of text in our document that refers to Asia. Okay, so we have the title, we have the text here, and in the figure caption. So we're going to look at how do we add all of those things? How do we fix all of those things with our report? So the first thing I want to mention is something called sort of inline code or sort of inline code text. So far when we've been writing R code, we've always put our R code in a nice little code block. But sometimes you want to use values from your code in a sentence. So that's where we do something called inline code. Right? So the way you write inline code is with one backtick and then an R. Okay? And this is basically saying, I want to write some R code. Okay? And then you just put in whatever kind of code you want to run. Okay? So if you wanted to write a sentence that tells you the number of rows that are in the Gapminder data, you would do sort of the number of rows is backtick R space and then end row. Okay? And that renders as the number of rows is 1,704. So this is how you use sort of code or variables inside a sentence. Okay. You can also add code in figure captions. It is slightly different. Okay. So when you're doing figure captions, you start it with a quotation mark and then EXPR, so expression. And then after that, it will put any R code you want to include. So in this example here, if you want to include a caption that says the number of rows is, you can pass in your code. So you can use glue or paste. Okay, so it's slightly different to the way you write inline code in a sentence outside of a code block. You're using that exclamation mark and then EXPR, and then you're sort of getting R to generate a sentence for you. Okay, but that will update your figure caption. Okay. I want to mention another couple of things here. We're not necessarily going to use these in the examples today, but I did kind of want to highlight them because they're sort of related to parameterized reports. So in Quarto, you can do something called conditional content, okay? And that's where you display content for only a specific output format, right? So you can either show or hide content depending on which format it is, okay? So if you have, if you're making an HTML document, you might want a sort of, let's say an interactive map, okay, where you can sort of zoom in. You can show that interactive map, make that content visible when it's an HTML document, and the content will only appear when it's HTML. You can also do the reverse. So there might be cases when you want to hide a particular piece of content. Okay, so you can do content hidden, and you can do it on less format. Okay, so you can sort of say, I only want to show it for this particular output format, or I want to show it if it's anything other than this. Okay, and do sort of show or hide. So that I use this quite a lot. If I'm making sort of a web version and a PDF version, you get a static image in the PDF version, but you get something interactive in the HTML version. Okay? You can actually take this a stage further. Okay? So you can combine the conditional content with parameters in your document. Okay? So you could write some inline R code that, let's say I have a parameter in my Quarto document called hide answers. Okay. And if hide answers is true, I want to hide the answers. Okay. So I use this quite a lot when I'm building teaching materials for students. I don't want them to see the answers, but I want me to see the answers. I write some inline R code that if the parameter in the document to hide the answers is true, it adds content hidden. I put the sort of whatever the answer is in between, and then I end that block. Okay, so you can combine parameters with being able to hide content. Okay, and this is really, really useful. There is also another way of doing this sort of thing called profiles in Quarto. Okay, so it's kind of a stage further. Okay, so if you're using Quarto projects rather than just Quarto documents, you can basically create a sort of multiple project configurations. Okay, so I could create a solutions configuration, and when I'm rendering the solutions version profile of the project, I hide the content. So this looks a little bit neater than what I showed you on the previous slide, but it does assume you're using projects and sort of, brings more complexity to the Quarto document. So it's a bit of a trade-off whether you want to write slightly messier code or whether you want a slightly more involved setup for your Quarto project. Okay, that was just to kind of highlight a thing you can do with Quarto and parameters. Okay, so we're going to jump back to Posit Clouds, and we're going to look at editing some inline R code, editing the title, and editing the figure captions. Okay, so I'm going to start with the inline R code. Okay, so I'm going to start by editing this sentence here. Okay, so a box plot of how the life expectancy in Asia has changed. So I want to replace the word Asia with some inline R code. Okay, so I'm doing single backticks and then a lowercase r, okay, and then a space, okay? And this is sort of saying, okay, I'm opening up some inline R code, and then what I want to pass in there is just the value of the parameter. Okay, I just want this. Okay, so I do params $, choose consonant. Okay, so you access the parameter values in inline code in exactly the same way you access them in a code block. Okay, so if I render that, it'll take a little second. Okay, so you can see now that this has updated. Okay, we can also update the title in exactly the same way. Okay, so our inline R code also works in the title. So exactly the same thing again, single backticks, lowercase r, and then params, $, choose consonant, and then we can re-render this. Okay, and the title has updated as well. Okay, so even though it's sort of in the YAML and it's sort of before you're working with R code, it still works. Okay, so if you're changing text in a sentence or something in the title, you can use inline R code, so a single backtick and a lowercase r. Okay? The only bit that we have left to change is the figure caption. And as I kind of mentioned on the slides, that's the only bit that's a little bit different. Okay, so we start here with sort of setting up that we're using an expression, and then you can use paste or you can use glue. Okay, I'm going to use paste just to introduce some variety, I guess. Okay, so if we're using paste, we would do life expectancy in would be the first part of my sentence. And then I want to pass in params $, choose continent. Okay. And that would create a sentence that says life expectancy in Europe, for example. Okay. One thing to note here is that this is going inside quotation marks. And because I'm basically trying to use quotation marks inside quotation marks, I'm switching between double and single quotes. Okay, so inside paste, I'm always making use of double quotes, and then I'm using single quotes to sort of capture paste. Okay, so that's kind of it's a nice feature of R that there are two ways to add quotation marks, and you can use them both together. Okay, so if we render that, okay, you can now see that this updates. Okay, and just again to sort of double check that it works, change the value of the parameter and re-render it. Okay, and you can see that my figure caption, my plot caption, my text, and my title all change. So I'm able to basically update every single aspect of my report just based on this parameter value here. Okay. Okay. So it is, I can see there's a few questions in the chat, so I will get onto them while you do some exercises. So if you go back to the reports.qmd file and look at the sentence that says a plot of life expectancy in 1952, use inline R code to use the parameter value, edit the title as well, and edit the figure caption in the inline code to use inline code for the parameter for the year. Okay. Okay, there is a good question in the chat, basically asking if the inline code is used for text before the R chunk, will it run? Generally, not. Okay, so let's say that I sort of did this. Okay, so I wanted to use let me uh, let's say, so before I've loaded the Gapminder package, okay, EGR and roll Gapminder. I think this is basically what your question is basically if I try to use something in inline code before chronologically in my document before I've loaded it, does it work? Okay. The answer is no, it doesn't. Okay. So it is basically very similar to like an R script, okay, or sort of R code. It assumes you've done it in order. Okay. One thing that I find quite useful, which I guess is kind of related, is if you are using inline R code and the sort of piece of code that you want is very long, I would sort of have an extra code block just above the sentence that runs the code in the code block and saves it as a variable. And it makes your sentences sort of shorter and a little bit more readable. Okay. But yeah, the answer to your question is it doesn't work unless the code runs in order, basically. Okay. So one is a question kind of about this function here. And in the function we're using choose underscore continent, but in the text we're using params $ choose continent. So the reason that sort of with inside the function body we're just using choose continent is because the argument of the function is using choose continent. Okay, so this sort of choose continent is completely separate from this choose continent. Okay, I have chosen to give them the same name because I find it then easier to sort of match up uh, different things. So I'm passing in params choose continent to the choose continent argument of the function. Okay, so these are sort of basically two completely separate variables. I could have chosen to call this something else. I chose to call them the same thing. Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat is sort of how do we update file names so that we get rather than getting sort of report.html, we maybe get reports underscore Asia, for example. We will do that in the next section. And there's another question about can you add the date that you create the report on? Yes, we can look at that as well. Okay. So in R, you can always get the date with sys.date. Okay, so if you run this, okay, you just get the date. So you can always use that in your R code. There's a couple of questions in the chat. So some of them again related to sort of output files, and in the Quarto YAML there is an argument called output file. Yeah, I don't think inline R code works in that. But what I'm going to show you in a second is sort of how to use R code outside of your Quarto document to do that as an alternative way. Okay. There's also someone else asking about using the epoxy R package for inline code blocks. It's not something I've kind of used a lot, unfortunately. So if there is someone else kind of in the workshop who has some experience of using it, please do feel free to kind of share that with the group in that question. So what we're now going to look at is rendering multiple reports. Okay, so what we've sort of been doing so far is manually typing in the value of choose continent that we want to use and then clicking render. And that's okay if you just want to make one report. Okay, so if you do just make one report each month, maybe this is fine. Okay, just opening up a Quarto document, changing a value and clicking render. Maybe that's okay. But if you want to make outputs multiple reports at the same time, that's going to get sort of very tedious and annoying very, very quickly. So what we're going to look at is how do you create multiple reports at once, okay? The other thing you could do is use a command line, okay? So you can, in Posit Cloud, you can click render, or you can open up the terminal, okay? And you can use that to render reports. But there's an easier way, okay? And that is by using the Quarto R package, okay? So I think this is something that can be a little bit confusing, particularly if you are coming from R Markdown, because R Markdown is itself an R package. Quarto is not an R package, okay? It's a sort of separate piece of software, but there is an R package called Quarto, which gives you some user-friendly ways to interact with Quarto. And if you have used some of the like knitr or R Markdown functions before, they look kind of similar. So it's basically an alternative to the render button. We can use this Quarto underscore render function from the Quarto R package. Okay. Well, then you could do a for loop, right? You could sort of have this list of um, parameter values that you want to do and loop over it and call Quarto render multiple times. That certainly is one way to do it. But what I'm going to show you how to do it is use the per package. Okay, so if you haven't used the per package before, it's basically a nice way to replace for loops with code that's a little bit shorter, and hopefully a little bit easier to read. Okay, and what it lets you do is map over a vector of different sort of parameter values. Okay, so in our example, it might be different continents, it might be different time periods. So the per package has lots of different functions in it. I guess the most sort of commonly used ones are probably map, okay? But there is a function in the per package called walk, and that's the one we're going to be looking at, okay? So when we're running our functions, we don't actually want sort of our output, we want the Quarto output. So we're calling the Quarto render function for its side effects, okay? So rendering a report. So the walk function will just be sort of quietly making Quarto reports for us. If you are more of a base R person, that's absolutely fine. You can do something similar with the apply family of functions. Okay, so again, it's the same sort of idea of mapping over some input vector and applying a function to each of those inputs. Okay, so we're going to look at using the Quarto R package and using her to generate multiple reports. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to open up a new R file. Okay, so this is something that we don't want to put inside our Quarto document. It's something that we're going to put in an R script outside of our Quarto document. Okay, so we'll have two packages that we're going to work with. So I'm going to just start by loading both of those. Okay, so use library Quarto and library per. And then I'm going to render my document. Okay, so I'm going to use the Quarto render function. So the only input, I guess, that's absolutely essential to the Quarto render function is the Quarto document you want to render. Okay, and in our case, what it's going to be is it's going to be the example.qmd file. Okay, so I pass that in as the input example.qmd, and if I run this, okay, you can see it's starting to render my Quarto report, and I get my output here, exactly the same way I would if I just clicked render here. Now, what we haven't done here is change the parameter value, right? Because we have a default value for choose continent, if I don't tell the Quarto render function which one to use, it uses the default value. If I want to pass in a value uh, for the parameter, we add that to the execute params argument. Okay, so execute underscore params, which is equal list. Okay, so because you can have multiple parameters in a Quarto document, we stick them in a list. Okay, here we only have one, but it still goes sort of in a list here. And we do choose continent equals, and then whichever value of the parameter we want to use. Okay, so if we want to create a report for Europe, we do choose underscore continent equals Europe. Okay, and then if I run that line of code, okay, it re-renders my report and puts Europe in as a value to param. So it overrides that default that I've got written in and updates my report. Okay. So now what I want to do is I want to create multiple reports. Okay, so there are multiple continents, so I want to create one report for each continent. So the first thing I need to do is figure out what are the continents. Okay, so if we go back to our Gapminder data, okay, all of our continent values are in the continent column. Okay, so I can use the unique function to get a list of the unique continents. Okay, so you can see that there are 5 different values here. So I'm going to use the walk function from per. Okay, so the walk function has 2 arguments. The first argument is the vector of things that you want to map over. So that is this vector here. Okay, so it's that list of unique continents. The second argument to walk is the function that we want to apply. So what we want to apply is this function here. Okay. So we want to apply this function to each element. Okay, so there's 2 things I need to change here. First thing, I need to get rid of the sort of hard-coded value Europe and put in .x. Okay, so this is basically saying for each value in this, the argument to what I've passed into .x, put that value in there. Okay, so the first time it runs, it will put Asia in here, and then Europe, and then Africa, and so on. Second thing I can do is add a little tilde. I need to do is add a tilde at the start of Quarto render. Okay, so let's see what happens when I run this. Okay, it's going to take a little while because it is rendering 5 separate Quarto reports. Okay, and you can see them all sort of popping up here. Okay, I'm just going to let it keep going until it's finished. Okay, so that's, you kind of saw that flashing up on the viewer screen as rendered 5 separate reports. However, if I go back to files, okay, and I look for all of those reports, well, it looks like there's only one of them. Okay, I only have this example.html file. Okay, and the reason that I only have one file, even though I've generated 5 reports, is because by default, when you render a Quarto document, it gets the same name as the input file. So it always generates a report called example.html. Okay, so every time I generate the next report, it overwrites the last one. So the way I do that is by updating the name of the output file. Okay, so what we can do is we can specify a name for the output file, and we can use the glue or paste functions again. So let's say that I want my report to be sort of report underscore and then the name of the continent. Okay, it would be report underscore dot HTML. I use the curly brackets in glue to add .x. Okay, so I'm passing in the value of the continent to both the document parameter and output file. Okay, so now if I run this, okay, again, you can see it's taking its time because it's generating all those reports, but what you can see is that it's got multiple reports being saved now. Okay, so I have a report called report underscore Asia.html, report Europe, report Africa, and so on. So now I actually do have 5 reports and they're all separate values. Okay. The other thing that someone in the chat asked about earlier on was adding the date. Okay. So what you could do is you could have a report underscore continent underscore then the date it was rendered. And so you can use glue multiple times and just pass that sys.date function inside those glue curly brackets, and that will add the date you rendered the report on to that file name. Okay, so that is quite a useful question because then if you are updating reports, you can see when is the last time this was actually rendered. So what I'd like you to do is write some R code that renders a version of the report you've been making for the year 1972 using the Quarto render function. And then what I'd then like you to do is render a version of your report for all of the years in the data. Okay, so I think you're something like 10 reports or something like that I'd like you to make. Okay. And again, make sure you update the file name as well. You don't want to render 20 reports and then get to the end and discover it's only saved one of them. Okay. And I will go through the questions in the chat as well. I can see there's another few questions coming through in the chat. So some that Libby's answered around. So when you run Quarto render, the reports might not always come up in the viewer tab. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. Compared to clicking render, if you are generating, lots and lots of reports, you don't want this kind of flashing up, and that will probably mean that it might actually take longer because it's kind of interactive. So don't worry if you're not seeing things in the viewer pane. So I guess the difference between running things interactively versus R. There's another question in the chat is, can you have multiple parameters in the Quarto render? Yes, you can. That's why we saw. So if yeah, multiple parameters. So let's say our report also had another parameter called choose year. Okay, in Quarto render, you would have choose underscore year equals some particular value. So in per, there is a function walk to, okay, and that would have sort of dot y, if I remember correctly, and that would let you pass dot y in here. Okay, so you can sort of pass multiple things in. If you are trying to create if you have multiple parameters and you're trying to create every possible combination of those, I would probably create a data frame with different columns for each of the parameters. You can use sort of expand to automatically create that data frame, and then use sort of each row of the data frame to go into some of the per functions. I think it's probably the easiest way, and it keeps it a little bit tidier. Okay, another couple of questions. One, can you use parameters when creating a report for different sections? So rather than having 5 reports, you have one report with different sections. I probably wouldn't use parameters for that. I would probably just sort of build one document. So because you have what you can sort of do I'm just kind of thinking out loud. Um, what I typically do is I have an R function that outputs markdown text. So it would output this um, from a function. You could also use the function that outputs the plot, and then you can, in your Quarto document, loop over those functions. Okay, it depends, how much text you're writing and how interactive you want it to be. But yeah, I would probably create functions rather than using parameters if you want the 5 things to repeat in one report. Yeah. Um, the other kind of thing that Libby's mentioned here, which is super helpful, is you by default when you're making your Quarto documents, they all go in the same directory as your QMD file, and that is um, not always a great thing, um, because if you're making lots of reports, it gets sort of very messy very quickly. So you can use sort of FS to move them to a different folder. Okay, so after your sort of rendering code using walk, you could have some other code that gathers up those files and puts them somewhere else. The other option is to use Quarto projects. So I quite often use Quarto projects even if so Quarto projects are initially developed for things like books and websites where you have lots of different Quarto documents and you kind of they're all related to the one project. I quite often uh, make it a Quarto project even when I only have one Quarto file, because what projects allow you to do is specify an output directory. Okay, so you could have like output directory is equal to reports, and it automatically renders them into that output folder. Okay, it's still not super flexible in that you can't have lots of nested, complicated files, but it does sort of stick all of the outputs um, into one place. I can see there's another couple of questions in the chat, which sort of Mike and Libby have helped to answer about using map versus walk from per. Okay, and yeah, as they kind of rightly said, we don't want anything kind of printed to the console, or we don't need anything um, printed to the console. We don't need any R output from our walk function, um, which is what you get with map. It does work using map. There's no like harm in it. Okay, so if I did map instead of walk, this code would run perfectly fine. But what you get printed to the console is um a it sort of prints a list to the console, and it's just an empty list. So you'll get like it basically counts sort of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and prints that to the console. There's no real harm in that, but it is annoying. So if you're generating something like 50 reports, you just sort of see your console fill up with empty lists. So walk is basically do the same thing, but kind of do it quietly. Yeah, and Louis added some code in the chat, which is super useful for moving those files if you have this list of files. So you can write some R code to get this list of files that you want to move, and then sort of pass those into the FS function and tell it where you want them to go. So that's a super useful piece of code there as well. So what we could do is that we could show you what the Quarto uh, sort of project file would look like. So if I just do new file, okay, so if I do sort of file save as, so when you're making Quarto projects, it's always Quarto underscore Quarto dot YAML. Okay, so that's what turns it into a Quarto project. and you can do sort of project and then output dash dir, and then just the name of the file. So it might be something like outputs. If you are rendering to put stuff on GitHub pages, you can set output directory to docs, and it kind of works really nicely when you're updating to GitHub. It's certainly what I do quite frequently. So if you're not making a book or a website, you don't usually have to sort of specify that which files belong to your project. Basically, any .qmd file that's in the same place as your YAML file would be sort of included in the project. So let's just see if this works. So if I re-render my example.qmd file, okay, you can see, okay, it's rendered my report. But also if I go, it's now created an outputs folder and my example file is in there. So I don't need to change anything about my Quarto file. All I've done is added this underscore Quarto YAML file and said, put it all in a folder called outputs. So that's one kind of um, quick way. Okay. Um, Another sort of question um, in the chat. So one question is it normal to not see the plot in your report? No. So make a couple of things as Victoria's said. Um, is make sure that you don't have sort of eval false anywhere. Make sure that you're also kind of calling the plot as well. Okay. The other thing is that you can create so what you'll see here is when I make this example.html file, there's an example underscore files function, and this has all of the figures in it. What you can also do is make self-contained Quarto documents so that the files aren't in a separate folder. That can sometimes be an issue in that it's looking in the wrong place for the images. So you can make them self-contained files as an alternative. So you can maybe have a go at that. Yeah, there's a few questions in the chat about making tables instead of plots. Yes, you can do the same thing. So I guess with tables, there's a few more things to think about with plotting tables. In that there are lots of different R packages for making tables, and some of them work better for some output types than others. So it depends whether you want like an interactive table, which will work in HTML, or you might have, a sort of static table in a PDF. To get around that, you can use things like the conditional content we talked about earlier if you're making multiple output formats. But you could, as a sort of very uh, simple approach, let's do one now. We have a couple of minutes. Okay, so if you had a table here, okay, you could okay, um our my Posit Cloud is crashing, so I guess I'm not doing a demonstration. Let's see if this comes back up or if everything is gone. But you could make a plotting function in the same way we made you can make a table function in the same way we made the plotting function. So something that filters your data and sort of creates a summary table, and it outputs it in like knitr or like cable extra, for example. Okay. Okay, so you might have um a function very quickly. So continent table. Okay, so this does the same thing. And this is one thing I didn't kind of mention earlier, is that if you are using the same data for multiple outputs, so here we're sort of filtering the data, making a plot, and then we have another function that's using the same input data, but we're sort of filtering it twice. It would sort of make more sense to have another function that filters the data and then one function that just plots it but doesn't do the filtering. Okay, so you can create a function to make tables, okay, using whichever plotting or sort of table package you prefer. And you can render this and it will just add the table in the same way. Okay, so you get this kind of table here. Okay, so yeah, create a function that makes the data to go into the table and then whichever table package you prefer. There are lots of different options. Okay. Okay. There's another question about using the sort of show and hide stuff, the conditional content. If I go here, okay. So this isn't in a code block, okay? This is just sort of in your Quarto document, sort of in where you would put text. You would just add this here. Okay, if I just copy and paste this to show you, okay, it would just go in here. You can see you get this nice little highlighting here. So you can put anything in here. So you can put code blocks inside the conditional content. Okay, so if you only want to show output if it's a PDF format, and you can see there's nothing added here. This content is hidden unless it's a PDF document, so it doesn't appear. Okay, the other question was around the Quarto YAML stuff. Okay, so you create this underscore Quarto dot YAML file, and it's just project and then output dash dir, and then that's kind of where it will go. Um, yes, so there's another question about making tables is rather than repeating um country names multiple times, could you just sort of have one? I can't remember what I was doing the other day, but I did exactly that the other day, using Cable Extra. So it's, if you're making tables with Nithar, Cable Extra can do that quite easily for you. Okay. Okay. I can see there are still another few um, questions in the chat. I will try to come back to them in a second if we have time. If not, I will download the chat and write a blog post with any unanswered questions. So just a reminder that the workshop resources are online. So all of the examples I've gone through and the sort of solutions for the exercises, the slides are all online and they will remain online. So feel free to use them if you like. You can download the slides as a PDF as well if you prefer. Yeah, and the other thing that is on the website is a list of some other useful resources. So if you are kind of new to writing things like functions, the R for Data Science book has a nice sort of section on writing functions, so that might help you when you're parameterizing your plots. Quarto documentation is awesome, and there's a whole section on parameters. Cara Thompson has some really, really nice resources on parameterized reports. And there's also a blog post from Mandy about parameterized presentations. So if you want to make reveal JS slides, but multiple different copies, there's some nice examples here. And I have also recently put together a list of all of my favorite data science resources. So I've linked that there as well. Um, I will try to kind of keep going through the chat and answering some questions. But otherwise, thank you very, very much for coming along to today's session.
Nicola, if I may jump in, just to also close the session, saying huge thanks for this workshop. You're an incredible speaker, and it was a very informative and engaging workshop. I learned so much for myself that even though I've been using R for a while, like I'm not using glue enough. That's a fantastic function, and parameterizing and Quarto documents. That's a really neat feature. I just want to echo one of the commenters. I think it was Torsten. He said, "Whoa, I'm learning a lot. Great to see how experts do this," which is absolutely true. One thing that I want to mention, you guys, so there is a way to get credit for attending the workshop. If you were here for 75% of the time, please scroll up and look at like the chat was super active. So you can find the post with like a whole bunch of medal emojis, and that contains, I'll also actually Phil just posted the link to the form that you need to fill out again. So thank you so much. And yeah, Nicola, so back to you. And whenever you are ready, you can just close the session whenever you're done.
Perfect. Thank you. I will just download the chat very quickly so that I can answer some of those questions afterwards. But yeah, thank you all.